Hi, my name is Mike Dennis. I was born Mike Bunis, but I changed my name a few years ago. And I'm doing this video, it's a series of videos actually, chronicling my life story, specifically with a focus on my life in music. And those of you who know me know that I've spent most of my adult life as a professional musician, a pianist, and I wanted to get it all down, the things that I've done and seen, so that perhaps in some future generation, someone might watch these videos and say, "Who the hell is that guy?" No. Okay. Anyway, so here we go. It all started on a frosty evening in a small town in upstate New York. The world was at war, and yet into this peaceful village a child was born, bringing with him the hopes and dreams of all mankind. How do you like it so far? No. Okay, seriously now. All right. I was born April 1st, 1945, April Fool's Day, and it was also Easter Sunday that year. And it was also the day that my father, who had enlisted in the Navy, was involved in the invasion of Okinawa, which turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. I was born in Seneca Falls, New York, which was a small town in the Finger Lakes district of New York State. I like to say it's so far back in the woods, they have to pipe in sunshine. But it really is kind of out of the way. And it's not near any really big city. I mean, not near for a kid in any way. It's, I think, 50 miles from Rochester and maybe 40 miles from Syracuse. We're like the nearest, quote, big cities around. And it was a factory town, which meant that it had a lot of factories and mills which steamed along. They made their products, and they hired local people, and they provided a lot of jobs, and they did very well. The town did very well like this until it didn't. And then it hasn't been doing so well for quite a few decades now. But nevertheless, that's where I was born, and I lived there with my mother. I was an only child, by the way, at my grandmother's house until I was about a year old when my father came home from the Navy. And then he worked for a company in Seneca Falls that immediately sent him to work in Boston. And we got an apartment in the town of Somerville, which was a suburb outside Boston. And my first memory is I can remember walking outside our little apartment building with my mother saying, "Mom, where do we live?" And she says, "We live in Somerville, Mike." And I'm thinking, Somerville, what a great name. I mean, how beautiful is that? Somerville. I just thought that was so great. Anyway, that was my earliest memory. Well, I didn't have too much else to remember about Somerville because later on we moved to, not too long after that, we moved to Back Bay, which is another area of Boston, which now I understand is somewhat cheesy, high rent. But back then it was decidedly low rent. And believe me, if we lived there, it was low rent. It was sort of an urban area, and it was about 3 or 4 blocks from Fenway Park, where the Boston Red Sox played their baseball games. Now, when I was in Back Bay, living there, we had a small 1-bedroom apartment. And unlike the shotgun apartments of other cities, this was, I don't know what you call it, but instead of being long, it was wide and shallow. You walked in, and the bedroom was on the left. The kitchen / dinette was right in front of you when you walked in, and over on the right was his living room. And all 3 rooms were very tiny. The whole apartment probably didn't take up more than 300 square feet. Anyway, that's where we lived. My parents had a record player, and my mother called it a Victrola. They liked music, and they bought what few records they could afford, and the 78 RPMs. And one of them was a record called "I Wonder, I Wonder, I Wonder" by a guy named Eddie Howard. Now, my mother played this, and I can remember going over to the record player, looking down at the record spinning around, and when it stopped, I saw it was on the Majestic label. For some reason, I remember that. I don't know why. But I asked her to play it again, and she played it again, and I was constantly asking her to play this song, "I Wonder, I Wonder, I Wonder." And not long ago, I looked it up on Spotify, and I played it, and it was an ordinary song. It had good harmonies on it, and it was sort of a band arrangement, not big band, but sort of a big band arrangement, I guess you would call it. Definitely pre-rock and roll. Came out about 1947, and it was my This was my first introduction to music. I Wonder, I Wonder, I Wonder by Eddie Howard. I have no idea what became of Eddie Howard. I never heard anything else out of him. I don't know anything else about him. But he was the one that gave me my first introduction to music. Well, anyway, along about when I was in maybe fourth grade, we moved to, second grade, second grade. We moved to Wellesley Hills. My father got a promotion, I should say, moved to Wellesley Hills, which was a real suburb now of Boston. This was a real suburb. Clean streets, clean homes. It wasn't very high end. It was sort of middle of the road kind of suburb, but it was very clean, and there were a lot of kids in the neighborhood to play with. My mother never had to worry about me going outside and getting in trouble, getting in any kind of anything happening to me. So while we were in Wellesley Hills, she enrolled me in Catholic school because she wanted me to get a good education. So I went to Catholic school, and in the Catholic schools in those days, and maybe today too, I don't know, but the nuns made everybody take piano lessons. It didn't matter who you were, whether you were young, old, what grade you were in, boy, girl, whatever, you had to take piano lessons. This was called St. Joseph's Academy. And this was where I was introduced to piano. And I started taking piano lessons, and the first thing they teach you is the scales. You know, they teach you how to play the notes of the piano, how to play a scale, how to play the scale in every key, and then they teach you how to read music. They show you lined paper with the notes and where the notes are, and how to read the music on that lined paper, or staff as they call it. They taught you about time signatures and all that kind of thing. All right, well then they eventually got into teaching you how to play actual music. And the first thing that we had to learn was John Thompson, Book 1, red cover, classical music. And but it wasn't anything complicated. It was very elementary classical tunes, meant for introductory work for students, like myself. And it was all these songs I'd never heard of, and frankly left me cold. I wasn't interested in them at all. I didn't really like playing them, but I had to play them because that's what the lessons were all about. So I played them, and the nuns let me practice after school because we didn't have a piano at home. So this went on for a while, and then about a year later, one of the nuns called my mother. Now, I didn't find out about this call until like 50 years later when my mom told me about it. But at the time, I didn't know about it. She called my mom and said, "Do you have a piano at home?" And my mom said, "No." And the nun said, "Well, you better get one because Mike is showing an exceptional interest in the piano, and he's very good at it, very talented. I strongly recommend you get a piano." Well, not long after that, I guess it was, they delivered a spinet piano, used spinet piano, was all my father could afford at the time. I knew it was used because it had little wear marks around it and everything, and the person who owned it before had left a music book inside the bench. And I looked in the bench, and there it was, and it was a book of folk songs. And I opened it up, and it was two-handed piano scores, just like with the classical music with John Thompson. But these were songs, these were folk songs, they weren't classical songs. And the first one I looked at was Old Folks at Home, or Swanee River as they called it. You've heard that song, right? I'd heard it too, believe it or not, back then. I don't know where, the movies or something, but I'd heard it somewhere, and I liked it. And I went ahead and learned it, played both hands like it was written out, just like I was taught to play by the nuns. Well, this was the first song that I learned on my own, and where I learned the first song that I learned that I could relate to, that I really liked. So I was very proud of myself of having learned this song that I really liked, that I knew from somewhere, and having learned it so I could play a passable version of it. And I remember whenever we had company, my parents would drag me out and make me play this song, right? So anyway. This goes on until fourth grade, when we moved back to Seneca Falls. My father gets another promotion. We moved back to the company headquarters in Seneca Falls. And we're back there. My mother enrolls me in another Catholic school. Now, they didn't give piano lessons at that time in this school, but she did get me lessons with a lady named Mrs. Lyke, L-Y-K-E. And Mrs. Lyke was a nice lady. She was a good piano teacher, and she was the local piano teacher in Seneca Falls. I took these lessons. Now, by now, of course, I think I had graduated to John Thompson Book 2, boom, blue cover, all right? But it was still the same old classical, kind of what I thought were boring songs that I didn't like. I couldn't relate to them at all. They just didn't speak to me. And but I continued the lessons with Mrs. Lake, and this went on until I want to say I was in high school. Now I might have quit lessons with Mrs. Lake, so I think I did quit somewhere along the way, and I was not taking any lessons at all for a couple of years until I got to high school, and then when I was about 13, my mother said, I'm going to have you take piano lessons from Pop Curry. Now, Pop Curry was a local guy. He worked in the post office. He was an older gentleman, but he also played 3 nights a week at a place called Belhurst Castle up in Geneva, New York, about 10 miles away. Belhurst Castle was a real castle. It was located on the shores of Seneca Lake, in the Finger Lakes, and it was this beautiful old building. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about it or the history of it or anything. But my parents, they reconverted the bottom floor, into a restaurant, a high-end restaurant, or as high-end as that you could get for that area. And my parents used to go up there once every 2 or 3 weeks to have a nice dinner and hear Pop Curry and his little trio play music, and they'd dance. Then they'd come back home and rave about the music and all that. And one night they just asked Pop if he would give me lessons. And Pop said, sure, I'd be happy to show Mike anything I know. So the first lesson, Pop comes over to the house. Came over to the house now. With Mrs. Lake, I had to go to where she went, which is where she gave her lessons in the local Grange Hall. And Pop came over to the house one night a week. And for the first lesson, he said, now, Mike, he said, we're not going to try to read music or anything like that. This is not going to be classical music. And I breathed a big sigh of relief. And he said, I'm going to show you how to make chords. I might add that Pop Curry, with these lessons, emerged as one of the single most, if not the single most influential person in my entire life outside of my parents. The most influential person in my life, because he taught me how to play piano the way I really learned how to play. And I can say, without any tongue in cheek, he made me what I am today. He said, now the first thing you got to realize is the chords have relationships to one another. I'm going to show you how to make a chord. Here's a C chord. And he showed me the notes, and he made me play it. So, and he pointed out that these notes are in the C scale. There's certain notes of the C scale which I could recognize, but he said there's certain notes. They're not just any notes. There's certain that. Yes. Now I'm going to play an F chord. I said, listen to the interval between the C and the F. Da, da. Right? Now I'm going to play a G chord and back to C. So he said, now listen to these intervals, and especially listen when the G goes back to C. And when that G went back to C, it was like, a big exhale, and you're back home in C. And that's how he put it. He said it resolves back to C. Now you hear those intervals. I want you to listen how far they are apart. How this interval is different from this interval. They're different. And he taught me to listen for these intervals, effectively teaching me how to play by ear. Now that's why I went into all this stuff. It's kind of technical, but he was effectively teaching me how to play by ear. And that's where I picked up playing by ear. I don't know if I would have ever picked it up otherwise. So I took to this immediately, these lessons. And Pop had with him these Tundex cards, which were 3x5 cards. He called them Tundex. 3x5 cards of each one had a song on it. And the songs were printed on a musical staff with just one line melody line, one note melody line of the whole song, and a chord designation written above it. And I was to play the single note melody line with my right hand and a chord with my left hand. And he showed me how to play stride like that, and he showed me how to play different left hand patterns. but I was always to play the melody line with my right hand, and the chord, there's something based around the chord with my left hand. And the first two songs that I learned how to play, I remember, were Muskrat Ramble and Laura. And Laura, I'd never heard of either one of the songs. I'd heard of Laura, but I didn't really know too much about either song. Laura was a beautiful song, beautiful song. I think I heard it in a movie or somewhere, and it was just a gorgeous song. And you know, even all these years later, after all the rock and roll and the country and everything else, I still know how to play Laura. I never forgot that. Even through all of the rock and roll, I always remembered how to play Laura with its very complex, beautifully woven chords. Now, Pop said, so I learned several of these songs, and then and I was really getting into it. You know, I was practicing every day and learning how to play, and a lot of these songs I had heard of. I remember Darktown Strutter's Ball was one I'd heard of, one of my father's favorite songs. So I learned how to play that. He had the Tunex card for that one. And anyway, he also said that these Tunex cards were little, like I said, they were 3x5 cards, but they were taken from what he called a fake book. A fake book was a big book, I don't have one handy right now, but a big book that contains about 1,000 songs in it, and each song is laid out with a one-note melody line and a chord designation above it. And they have about 1,000 songs in it. Now, at the time, fake books were illegal due to copyright issues. And you had to, if you wanted to buy one, it was all under the counter. You had to, you know, be very sinister and ask quietly if you had a fake book and this kind of thing. And but Pop got me a fake book, and I remember they were $20, and my mother shelled out the $20 for the fake book. I certainly didn't have it, so my mother paid for it, and it had 1,000 songs in there, and I could pick any song I wanted and learn how to play. And I just dove right in. It was just wonderful. This fake book, I'd never seen anything like it. All right, well, anyway, sometime after that, I went down to the local music store, and they had sheet music in there, and I bought a sheet music for Who's Sorry Now. Now, anybody who's my age or a little older or even a little younger will certainly remember this song and know that it was a monster hit for Connie Francis. And it was a beautiful, slow song, and it was played constantly on the radio, and everybody knew this song back in those days. And I opened up the sheet music, and it had the two lines, two hands, left and right hand, printed notes that you were supposed to play, a la classical music. And it also had a single note melody line with the chord designation above it, a la fake book. And so that's how I learned to play. I did the single note melody line. You know, and I learned how to play that song about like that, you know, very basic. And I learned how to play it, and I was just thrilled to death that I could play a song that was on the radio. Oh, Jesus. I mean, I couldn't believe that I could play a song that was on the radio, you know. Now, I have to interject here at this point that Seneca Falls, I've told you, it was a small factory town, and which it was. But it was very remote. It had no real outside influences. I mean, we had radio and TV, of course, but that was it. There was no music, no live music at all in Seneca Falls, and I mean none. There were no venues for live music. There was no art. There was no literature. There was very little architecture of any consequence. There was no culture of any kind. I grew up with very, very few cultural touchstones that I could relate to, you know. Pop Curry was my link to the outside world as such, with his little Tunex cards and fake book. You know, this was all I had to go on. I never heard anybody play these songs. I could never walk into a place and hear somebody actually play any song live. I could not do that because it just didn't exist in Seneca Falls. And at age 13 or 14, I couldn't go any place where they had such people. So I felt like I missed out on a lot because of that. But nevertheless, I learned Who's Sorry Now, and I was just delighted that I could play a song that was on the radio. And I realized that if I could play Who's Sorry Now, that every other song on the radio was within my grasp, that I could play it. I could play them. And I mean, I remember my mind it was hard for me to get my mind around that I could play every song that was on the radio if I put my mind to it. So one day we were sitting around. I was by now I'm in high school, and it's like my freshman year in high school. I think I might have just turned 14. I don't know, somewhere around there. They had and I was learning some of these tunes on the radio by this time, and they had all the kids used to gather in the cafeteria before school to wait for the bell to ring. So I'm standing around with everybody, and they're all yakking and jabbering, and I look over against the wall, and there's an upright piano sitting against the wall, and everybody else is standing around, and I'm sidled over to the piano, and I sit down at it, and I start playing one of these rock and roll tunes that I had learned from the radio. I can't remember what it was, but I started playing it, and I didn't get 3 or 4 bars into it when all of a sudden all the girls come rushing over, and they start hovering over the piano and hovering over me, and I'm playing, and I look up, you know, and I see them all hovering over me, and they're all smiling and everything, and I go, yeah, hey, you know, this is all right, you know, and that was the first time that I had ever played in public, and I mean, public, sort of public. I mean, it wasn't, you know, public invited. It was just for high school students, but it was the first time I ever played for anybody other than myself or my parents or one of their guests at home. And it was there was a lot of people there, and they all gathered around the piano, and they all had a great time, and they applauded when I was done, and then the bell rang, and we all had to leave. All right, and by the way, the one of the teachers told me, never do that again, you know, to play that nasty rock and roll music. So you have to understand that rock and roll in those days was looked upon with great skepticism by the adults of America. They thought that rock and roll was a danger to the children. It was going to lead them into juvenile delinquency. You know, they were afraid about, you know, they were afraid about crime and all this other stuff that kids were going to take up if they were exposed to rock and roll. They were afraid of, you know, sexual activity and God knows what. And of course, they had every right to be afraid. Look at the guys who were singing it. I mean, you had Jerry Lee Lewis, you know, Elvis, Chuck Berry. I mean, these guys were not Boy Scouts, okay? And you know, they were very sexualized guys who drew a lot of female fans, and they sang a lot of sort of semi-sexual oriented material. And so anyway, that was the state of America at that time. Well, sometime later that year, 1959, I'm 14, and I get a call from a lady who wants me to come play for like a luncheon that they have. She was with the Ladies Kiwanis, or one of those ladies' social groups, and they're having a luncheon up in Geneva, where it was on a certain day, and they wanted to know if I wanted to come play at it. And I said, well, of course, I'd love to. And they said, and we'll give you $10. And I thought, what? $10? $10 to come play music for a couple of hours? I mean, $10 for a guy like me. I mean, I used to walk around with no more than 30 or 40 cents in my pocket, you know, hardly ever more than $1, you know, and I never had bills. It was always just change, you know, like all my friends. We were, you know, none of us had much money, and that's what we had carried around. But now here I am, I get to earn $10 of my own just for playing piano for a couple of hours. Holy shit, I couldn't believe it. You know, this is the easiest money I'll ever earn, you know. So I wish I had written down the date, but I didn't. Doggone it, because it was a key date in my life. It was my first paying gig, 14 years old, 1959, and I didn't have another one until over a year later. But that was my first one, and I really enjoyed it. And the lady gave me the $10, and I was just couldn't believe I had a $10 bill. I put it in my pocket, way down deep in my pocket, where it'd be safe. And you know, I just thought I was on cloud 9. Believe me, cloud 9. All right. So anyway, moving forward to about January of 1961, about a year, maybe a year and a half later. I'm 15, and I'm in my sophomore year in high school, and I get a call from a guy who he says that, no, wait, excuse me, hold everything. Let me back up to earlier in 1960. Excuse me, let me get straight here. My freshman year in high school ended in 1959. I was 14. Now my sophomore year, this is my sophomore year, we had a school dance. This was like late 1959. This was right after I had played the Ladies Kiwanis gig, my first paying gig. We had a school dance, and I went to the dance, and there was a band up there that played, and the guy was playing guitar, and I mean, I couldn't believe it. There was no saxophone section or trombone section or anything like that. It was just a four-piece band: guitar, bass, sax, and drums, I think, or something like that. Anyway, they started playing rock and roll music. The first song the guy played was Hound Dog, you know? And I thought, all right, yeah, I like these guys. They were called Larry and the Satellites. Larry and the Satellites. And after about 3 songs, the student body was going crazy. You got to remember, this was the very first time I had ever heard live music in Seneca Falls, or for that matter, anywhere. The very first time I'd ever heard live music. And it was Larry and the Satellites playing Hound Dog in 1959 in our high school gym. And after about 3 songs, the principal got up there and grabbed the microphone and said, "This dance is over." And he threw them out, and the dance was over, you know? And I thought, these Larry and the Satellites got to be all right. They're okay in my book. You know, I got to look into these guys. Well, it turns out they were from, they weren't from Seneca Falls, of course, because there were no musicians from Seneca Falls, but they were from elsewhere, and they got this reputation for being thrown out of our school for playing rock and roll music, and of course that sent them on to area-wide fame. And anyway, so that was my sophomore year in high school. Now my junior year in high school, we move ahead to January of '61. I'm 15. I get a call from a guy who says that he's the business manager of a band, and he wants me to. They're losing their piano player, and he wants to know if I want to come and audition for them. So I said, well, sure, you know. So he said, all right. He had me meet at one of their houses, one of the guys' houses, where they had an old piano, and I could sit and audition with the rest of the guys right there. And they were called the Impalas. And I auditioned, I got the gig, but little did I know that the Impalas were a worked over version of Larry and the Satellites. Larry was there with his guitar. They just had, I think, a different drummer or something, a different sax player, I don't know. But it was a couple different guys, and then me on piano and a sax player. And no bass player, which was a big mistake, but I didn't know that at the time, because again, I did not come from any kind of musical heritage area where you just knew about this stuff. They had where they would have a lot of bands, and you should know if you're in a band, you have to have a bass player if you have a drummer. Well, anyway, we didn't have a bass player, and my first gig with them was at the Odd Fellows Hall in Waterloo, New York, the next town up, about 3 miles away. And we got paid $8 for it, not the 10 that I made from the Ladies Kiwanis, but $8, which was still way good enough for me. And the repertoire consisted of rock and roll and some country music and a couple of interludes each night, of square dance music. Yes, I played square dance music on this. This was my first band gig, by the way, and that's why this was important. It's my first band gig, and we played square dance music as well as a lot of rock and roll and some country. So this was where I got started with bands. And I played with the Odd Fellows. I played with the Impalas at the Odd Fellows Hall every Saturday, plus whatever other gigs we could pick up, starting in January of '61. Now this went on until going on almost summer of '61, right toward the end of school. And we were playing at one Saturday night, we were playing at a place called Holiday Bar and Grill up in Geneva. Now Geneva, by the way, I have to mention, I've mentioned it a couple of times here. Geneva was about 10 miles from Seneca Falls. but it was everything Seneca Falls wasn't. Geneva was sort of known as being the center of vice and temptation. Everything you wanted was in Geneva. Everything you desired was in Geneva. Everything your parents told you was bad for you was in Geneva. Everything that you could imagine was in Geneva. It was a city, about 10,000 people. It was not really a big city, a small city, but it had more than one downtown street. It had a cross street downtown, and they were both sort of urbanized. So it felt like a city. And more importantly than that, Geneva had a great long musical heritage. They had a lot of bands that were there. A lot of musicians came out of Geneva. A lot of people learned how to play instruments at a young age and joined bands. And there were just a lot of bands around Geneva. And the Wilmer Alexander and the Dukes, oh Jesus, one of the best bands ever in the entire country, ever. Wilmer Alexander and the Dukes came out of Geneva. And there was just a lot of good groups that came from there. And so they held up Geneva's musical heritage proudly, most of them. And one of these groups, this guy, when we were playing at the Holiday Bar and Grill in Geneva, this guy came up to me, a friend of mine from Seneca Falls, saying, Mike, there's this group here in Geneva that is looking for a piano player, and they heard about you, and they wanted to know if they asked me if I could get in touch with you, if they could call you, get your phone number. So I said, sure, give him my number. So he gave him my number, and then a couple of days later, I got a call from Jimmy Rinaldo. And Jimmy Rinaldo was the sax player for a group called the Starliners. And the Starliners were a well-known band from Geneva. They played a lot of places around the area and around upstate New York. And they were a good band. And they had, it was Jimmy on sax, Joey Venuti on bass, Ernie Pickard on drums, and myself on piano. And we played a combination of rock and roll and some rhythm and blues, but a lot of what they called, what Jimmy and the boys called commercial music. Now this meant it wasn't really pop music, but it was music that was popular, but it had a kind of a jazz tinge to it. Stuff like Mac the Knife and Louis Prima material, and that kind of thing. And so they played a lot of that stuff. And I liked that stuff, and I liked the rock and roll that they played. And they were good musicians, really good players, a lot better than the Impalas. And we had a really good sound. So we played up in Sodus all summer. And Sodus Point, everybody calls it Sodus, but Sodus Point was the name of the town. It was like the Atlantic City of that area. But it wasn't really it was like a low-grade Atlantic City. Because it was just a small little couple of restaurants and bars and, a couple of rickety hotels and on Lake Ontario. And, but we played there, and it was just wonderful. I was playing in Sodus. I thought I'd arrived, because this was, I went back to Seneca Falls and telling everybody, yeah, I'm playing in Sodus. But we played, it was just one night a week, but then we picked up other nights here and there, around the area. And so I'm playing with the Starliners, and I was just thrilled to death to be playing with them because they were a really good group. All right, well, then came the fall of '61, and it was back to school for my senior year. And the Starliners had gigs lined up at Syracuse and Utica and far distant cities, and my parents said there's no way that you can play those gigs because you have to go to school. And some of these gigs were on weeknights, and they said you're not going to be able to play on a school night, so you can only play on weekends. So I had to quit the Starliners, and I was really crushed to have to do that because I love those guys and I love that band. But I went back with the Impalas, and we played the Impalas and I played around the area for the rest of that school year. Then in sometime around '61, '62, during my senior year, I announced to my parents what I wanted to do for a living for the rest of my life. And they were all thrilled that I'd finally found a direction. And they said, what is it, Mike? What do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a professional musician. And their faces sagged and their shoulders drooped. And, my mother said, there's no way, you're not going to turn out like Frank Colarusso. Now, Frank Colarusso was this guy who lived in the next apartment when we lived back in Back Bay, in that little tiny apartment outside Boston. And it was down this dark hallway. He lived in the apartment right next to us at the end of the hallway. and he was a professional trombone player. And every night there were all these kind of shady-looking characters hanging around the hallway, and my mother would see them. She'd shelter me as we walked out the door, and she'd say, "You're not going to be like Frank Colarusso. You're going to get a decent job and marry a decent girl." So I mean, I couldn't stand up to my parents in those days because they ran everything. So I said, but I still love music, and the fire wasn't completely extinguished, but it was dimmed, shall we say. All right, so then during that year, I applied for college. My parents wanted me to go to Georgetown, a big Jesuit university in Washington, D.C., and I applied but didn't get in. And my parents were more disappointed than I was. So they arranged for me to get into a prep school the following year to do a year of postgraduate. And this prep school was called the Bullis School, and it was it was designed to get your college boards up so you could get into college. That was the whole purpose. It was really designed for kids to go to the Naval Academy because it was all founded by Naval Academy people, and although it wasn't a military school. But that summer of '62, I graduated in '62 from high school, and then that summer, to make sure that I didn't play any more bands, especially the Starliners, my father got me a job at the company that he worked for, at the lowest possible grade job that there was, which was a sort of janitorial job, picking up refuse around the grounds and in the buildings and all this kind of stuff. It's just a terrible job. I hated it. I hated every minute of it, and I just couldn't wait for it to be over. Little did I know how much I would hate Bullis more when I got there. But I hated that job. But finally, fall came around. I went to Bullis, and it was like prison. You couldn't leave except for holidays and weekends, and on weekends you had to have permission. But so I had to stay there the whole time, except for holidays when I went back to see my parents in Seneca Falls. Now, so I played there. I stayed at Bullis the entire year, and I did get into Georgetown that year. So once I got into Georgetown, I left Bullis. I didn't even take the last couple of final exams. I mean, what's the point? I've already gotten into Georgetown. I certainly didn't stick around for their graduation ceremony. So the summer of '63 rolls around. Now I've graduated from Bullis. I got Georgetown lined up for the fall, and now I'm home for the summer. I get right back to the Starliners, and they've got this great gig lined up in Corning, New York, which is about 80 miles south of Seneca Falls, right near the Pennsylvania line, home of Corning Glass. And Corning, New York was a town, a pretty good sized little town, and then we were playing in a place called Felici's Lounge, owned by an Italian guy, no kidding, named Nicky Felici. And Felici's was the place to go in Corning, the place to go. And we were playing Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And Thursday night was the night to be at Felici's, because it's where all the unattached people came to get dates, hook up for dates for Friday and Saturday when they would bring them to Felici's. All right? Okay, so it was three swinging nights every single week we played there. And more than that, we played there. I made $25 a night. I couldn't believe I was making that much money. $25 a night, $75 a week to play piano. 3 nights a week only, right? The rest of the time I didn't do anything. And $75 a week. There were guys that my age that had graduated from high school, same time I did, that were working regular jobs, blue collar jobs that weren't making $75 a week. Now granted, playing music is sort of a blue collar job, but it was a very good paying one. But I realized how fortunate I was to be able to play music and make this kind of money. I mean, at $75 a week, I thought I could live on that for the rest of my life. What did I know? But nevertheless, I was thrilled to be able to earn that much money. All right, so the fall rolls around, and I go to Georgetown. I enroll in Georgetown, fall of '63, and right away I meet a guy named H.K. Baker. And H.K. was a guitar player. What happened was I lived in a dorm in Georgetown, and down in the basement of this dorm they had an old upright piano. I found it. I went down and I was practicing on it, practicing all my rock and roll and some of the fake book songs, that Pop Curry taught me. And one day this guy comes in, H.K. Baker. He introduces himself, and he says he's a guitar player. And I said, oh, what kind of guitar you got? And he told me he had a Fender Jazzmaster, which was impressive because that at the time was just about the top of the line guitar that you could have. And so he said, but I also play piano. I said, you do? He said, yeah. He said, I play at the Officers Club out at some military base nearby one night a week. He said, I play progressive jazz. I said, progressive jazz, really? He said, yeah, let me show you. And he sits down and he plays, I think, Take 5. You know, it was and he plays it perfectly all the way through, solo and everything, did everything. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. You know, here's this guy. I mean, I'd heard Take 5 because it was a hit record for Dave Brubeck. So I knew the song, but I'd never heard anybody actually play it live. You know, because to me it only existed in the ether. You know, in the world of recorded sound and filtering down through, you know, radio signals into a radio and coming out the speaker. It really didn't exist in real life. You know. But here he was playing it on a real piano right before my eyes, and I'm watching his hands move while he's playing it. I mean, you got to understand what a big revelation this was to me, that somebody could actually play this kind of stuff, and play it so well. He was really, really good, and he played it. He played the one verse and then the bridge and then the solo and then came back to play the verse. It was about 2 or 3 minutes long. It wasn't much, but he played it, and I was knocked out by it. Knocked out, and I told him so. And you know, I felt about this big after HK played Take 5. You know, but anyway, he said, you know, why don't you and I get up a band? I'll play guitar. And he said, I know of a sax player. We can get one, then we can find a drummer. And I saw where this was going, right down into the no bass world. But, you know, I said, okay, because I asked him, I said, shouldn't we get a bass player? He said, no, you know, it's just another person you got to pay. He said, but I know that, and I don't know any bass players, you know, but I do know the sax player. We can get together, maybe start working right away. So that's what we did. We got together, the 4 of us, and we weren't very good. We started playing a few gigs around town, around the campus and around town, and but not much, you know. But HK was a, you know, every once in a while he would show me a little thing, like a little intro to a fake book tune, American songbook tune, and I'd try to learn it. And, you know, I mean, he was very nice about it. He wasn't arrogant about his abilities at all. So anyway, we played that year, you know, just kind of struggling along, and I knew we weren't very good. And then we went on the road, HK and I, we got a drummer. By now HK had gotten a bass, and he played bass on a few songs with our band. And then we got a drummer and HK and myself, and we went on the road. But HK did not want to play the bass. He wanted to play guitar. So, not surprisingly, we got fired from our first road gig after only about 3 weeks. The agent who booked us dropped us for the rest of the tour, and that was that. And we couldn't get any more work, so I came back to Seneca Falls and just, you know, moped around all summer long. That fall, I returned to Georgetown to HK and Company, and we played around a few other gigs, but I couldn't take it anymore. You know, so I left. By that time, we had gotten a new drummer. Danny Latham was his name. And Danny and I had become like this. And we became very good friends. As I like to say, we eventually became very close, closer than 2 guys could ever get without being gay. That's what I used to like to say. And we became close, and we were friends for the rest of our lives. Danny, may he rest in peace. He just passed away about a year ago. I was very fortunate to have seen him right before he passed away. So I was very lucky to have touched base with him at that time. But anyway, when we met back in early 1965, I had just turned 20, and Danny had just turned 18, and we were still playing with HK and the boys, but we realized that you know, the band was going nowhere. And Danny says, "Look," he says, "I know of a couple of guitar players." And I said, "No, hold it. Guitar player, we got to have a bass player." He says, "No, I know a bass player too." He knew one guitar player, and a bass player. And so he said, and so we got a hold of the guitar player and the bass player, and the guitar player said, "I know another guitar player, so we could have 2 guitars and get because by then the Beatles were in, we could have that Beatles sound, you know." And So I said, okay, so that meant 5 pieces: 2 guitars, bass, piano, and drums. Although I wasn't playing piano then, I had a Vox Continental organ, and which all the British groups had at the time. The British groups who had a keyboard player, the keyboards were always Vox Continental organ. So I had one of those, and we got together and we formed the New Breed. And the New Breed turned out to be a really good band, thanks in no small part to the fact that we had a bass player, and the guitar players, we had Bob Watson on guitar, Ted Bakewell on guitar, Chuck Lombardi, may he rest in peace, on bass, and Danny Latham on drums, and myself on organ. And we started playing, and right away we caught fire around the Georgetown campus and around the local Georgetown area. And we started getting gigs, really good ones. And then we got a gig to open for the Shangri-Las, and which I couldn't believe it. The Shangri-Las were having hit records at the time. I mean, this was right in the peak of their career, and we opened for them, and so then we decided, well, let's try to go all the way. Let's go make a record, a demo record, and we'll see what we can do with it. So we went into this recording studio in Washington, and we made the demo record of an original rock and roll tune, and it was really a good sounding record, I have to admit. Ted Bakewell got a really great fuzz tone sound on the intro of the guitar, and it was everything you'd want a rock and roll record to be. So we had a few demos pressed up, and we brought them back, and we gave one to the manager of the 1789, which was a bar for Georgetown students right there in the area, where all the Georgetown students hung out, and he put it on the jukebox. And next thing you know, they're all playing it, and not us, but the other people, the other students are playing it because they had heard us play it on our gigs. They all knew the words, they knew the song, they loved the song. The song was very popular. So, we kept going, we kept getting really good gigs. We opened for the Animals, one gig in early 1966, and we were the sky was the limit. So in spring of 1966, I flunked out of Georgetown. It was too much for me. I mean, I wasn't into it at all. I was really more into the New Breed and playing music, and I really wanted to get something going with the band. But I flunked out of Georgetown because, frankly, I was in academically over my head. These Georgetown professors were there to teach the next generation of world leaders. They knew that's what they were there for. And as a result, of course, I was not one of those next generation of world leaders. And, but the other students there were all very well educated before me. They had come from the finest prep schools, Boston Latin and all of these places. And they all knew about philosophy. They were well versed in music and art. They knew about art, the schools of art, and Impressionism and Postmodernism, and they knew about Nietzsche and Kafka and all these people. They knew about this stuff going before they got to Georgetown. So, for them it was nothing. But for me, when I heard Nietzsche, I had never heard of him. I didn't know what they were talking about. And I certainly didn't know what Nietzsche was talking about. Anyway, so that's why I flunked out. All right, my parents, of course, were crushed. But we kept going with the New Breed. And then in the summer, everybody the guys in the band went home. I stayed in Washington and worked jobs around Washington. I didn't play any music. But when the fall came back, fall of '66, I'm now 21 years old. And I'm still working just a regular job. I think I was working in a music store there, selling instruments. And the band came back, and they from summer vacation, and we got together again, and we started playing around more and more. We got more and more better gigs, and we had a gig coming up, February 11th, 1967. I remember this for 2 reasons. First of all, it was my last gig with the New Breed. Secondly, it was the day Danny Latham got married, and I was in his wedding. So he got married in New York. I got on a plane and flew down to Washington and played the gig that night with the New Breed. And that night we opened for the Young Rascals. And that, by the way, a little sidelight, the Young Rascals at that time, there was a band back then, they were having all their hits, and Gene Cornish was their guitar player. I think he maybe still is, or he was their guitar player for many, many years, and was on all their hits. And Gene Cornish, ironically, was the guy who took over from Larry in Larry and the Satellites when Larry left to go form the Impalas with one or two of the other guys. Gene called it Gene Cornish and the Satellites, and he kept the name, and that's why the Impalas were called the Impalas and not Larry and the Satellites, because Gene Cornish took the name. Gene was from that area somewhere, and Rochester, I think, and the band played all around Rochester until he joined the Rascals and made it big. But anyway, that was a little bit of ironic twist. So up until that time that we played with the Young Rascals, I could tell the guys in the band were getting less and less interested in the music and more interested in the spectacle. They were talking about, doing crazy things on stage and, stuff like spectacle things, setting guitars on fire. And, I just didn't think that was what we were all about. We played music very well. These guys played really well, and we had a really good sound. And by now, Chuck Lombardi had left the group, the bass player, and we got Billy Wilmot, who was another good bass player, and a very good guy. We all got along well with him. And but they did not want to pursue the music end of it. They wanted to just do spectacle and be cool, And then I tried to talk them into playing the summer of '67. Let's take this band and go out on the road and do something and see maybe we can get a record deal, And they were totally uninterested in that. Oh, I don't want to do that. I got to go back. I got a job waiting for me this summer, with my father's company, and I got to do this. I'm going to go hang around at the beach with my girlfriend. They were totally uninterested in it. So I lost interest in them, and so I quit February 11th, 1967, following the Young Rascals gig at the Washington Hilton Hotel. All right, now I was deeply disappointed, and from then until January '68, I worked odd jobs around the D.C. area, and then January '68 to January 1970, I went back to college out at New Mexico State in Las Cruces, New Mexico, down near the border. No music, and it was during that period that I decided, by default, since I wasn't going to be a musician, that I would go into advertising. So I graduated from New Mexico State in 1970, January of 1970, and from February to September of 1970, I worked for Gray Advertising in New York City, which was a Madison Avenue firm. They weren't on Madison Avenue, but they were one of the big Mad Men type firms at the time. In fact, Gray is mentioned a couple of times in the Mad Men TV series. Then in September of 1970, I just got totally disillusioned with New York. I liked advertising and I liked working with Gray, but I hated New York. And the people were too pushy and it was just too aggressive of a city. I just didn't like it. So I moved to Houston. And in Houston, I met some guys, and by the way, I got a job working in advertising in Houston, so in an advertising agency, and of course smaller than Gray, naturally, but it was advertising. It was the same work. And I felt very much at home. I was much cleaner. It was, I felt much more at ease, less pressure. And I met a few guys on the side, and together we opened up a place called Roy's Memory Shop. Roy's Memory Shop was a store dedicated to the sale of memorabilia in movie material, comic books, old records, that kind of thing. Things that people remember from when they were kids. It was probably the first shop of its type in the country, because I never knew of any place that sold old comic books or old records or all this kind of stuff together before Roy's Memory Shop. Old movie material, movie posters, that kind of thing. So anyway, this goes on. I worked for the local agency there, Metzdorf Advertising. I worked for them until 1973. All right, but now let me back up a bit. In early 1973, I came home from one night, from a Saturday night or something. I'd been out somewhere. I came home, it was late. It was about 1 o'clock, 1:30, and I turned the TV on, and they had this local Houston TV talk show, a late night TV talk show that came on one night a week, every Saturday. And they would always try to get if there was somebody famous playing in Houston, they would always try to get him or her to appear on this show. Well, this particular night in question, they had Dr. John. And, I couldn't believe that Dr. John, first of all, I didn't know who Dr. John was, but when they brought him out, I think he might have been on drugs or something, because they had to walk him over to the piano and set him down at the piano. And when he was at the piano, he immediately started playing the intro to a song called Stagger Lee, or as he called it, Stacker Lee. And when he started playing, my eyes bugged out like this, and I leaned forward, and I couldn't believe it. I had never heard anybody play piano like that. I'd never heard a piano sound like that before, anywhere had I ever heard a piano sound like that. He played Stacker Lee with this New Orleans kind of boogie-woogie feel, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was from New Orleans. I didn't know anything. All I knew is I'd never heard a piano sound like that. And he played 2 or 3 verses as a solo, and then he sang a couple verses, played another solo, sang the last verse, then he was out. And then he played The Mess Around by Ray Charles, which was, and he played that, and the Ray Charles song, and I couldn't believe, I'd never heard anybody play that song live. He played it just with no band or anything, just him. And it was just great. And I was so electrified that the next day I went out and bought his album. And the album had both those songs on it. And I listened to them over and over and over. And I realized that I had to learn, I had to go back to the piano. I had to learn these 2 songs. If I was ever going to find peace within myself, I had to learn these 2 songs. So I went out the very next day and I rented a piano.